Welcome to Chapter 2. The lecture today is on Chapter 2, big surprise, looking at the beginning from conception to birth. So that first 9-ish months of existence within the womb, from the moment of the individual cell to the millions and billions of cells that we become as we age. I'm going to try to keep this lecture somewhat short, at least to some extent, like comparatively, because I'm also wanting you to watch a video called Life Before Birth in the Womb. You'll find that video in the same area that you find this lecture. The video is a little over an hour, and so it takes some time, so that's why I'm going to keep the lecture somewhat short, because it shows you basically, for the most part, what I'm going to be talking about today. But with that also, quick note, you may have to sign into it on your YouTube account. So you can click into it. I give you the link to it also in the description for it. It'll pull up on YouTube. There is a scene at the very end where a woman gives birth. If I remember right, they don't actually show very much of that, but at the same time, YouTube deemed it worthy of putting a age restriction on it. So you have to sign in basically to show that you're 18 or older in order to watch that. But excellent video, because it's amazing, because you actually have clips from footage of the babies within the womb, which is amazing. So yeah, just like before, or like always, for the PowerPoint, if you want to follow along, you can pull that up, have it in a different window, have it in download it and have it available, or print it off. And I will just kind of let you know as we go along. All right, and also, just like always, there's going to be 4 random bits of information that I'm going to throw out there throughout these lectures. So and that'll be what's on the quizzes about this chapter. So let's see. I think that's everything. So let's get rolling. So slide 2, technically slide 1, but slide 2 is where we're going. Because slide 1 just says the beginning, chapter 1 or chapter 2. So slide 2, the beginning of life, part 1. First, the universal, right? All living things are composed of cells that promote growth and sustain life according to instructions in their molecules of DNA. In other words, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a single cell organism. It could be a banana. It could be a human being. It could be an elephant, a mouse, whatever. All of these things have DNA within the cell, which is basically the blueprint that the cell uses to structure the being for which it is part of. Okay, that's universally true. Doesn't matter what you are, right? Next slide, slide 3, beginning of life, part 2, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Okay, by the way, I am a psychologist, not a biologist, so I apologize in advance if I butcher some of these pronunciations. I'm also, I think I mentioned this before, but I'm mildly dyslexic, so it makes it a little interesting to get through. So molecule that contain DNA is a molecule that contains the chemical instructions for cells to manufacture various proteins. That's essentially what it is. It's going to be a long strand of protein chains, basically, that tell the given cells what to do. So it promotes growth and sustains life, like I already said. Chromosomes are going to be an aspect of the cell. So it's a molecule of DNA. Consists of 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs, and that's going to be from, at least for humans, right? Other animals have different living things have different sets and different amounts of chromosomes available. The average human, though, is going to have 46. There are some incidents where you might have more or less, but those typically are going to be connected to different kinds of syndromes. One of the most famous being like Down syndrome and those kinds of things. With the 2 pairs, what this essentially is you get 23 from your mother and 23 from your father. They come together and they make you, right? So we're going to go more in depth in that as we go. Next slide, slide 4, the beginning of life, part 3, the zygote. So the zygote are the 2 little gametes, the sperm and the ovum, combine and produce a new individual with 23 chromosomes from each parent. So yeah, gives you those options to pull from. This is a picture that's also, if you find this in the book, it's basically the moment that, or a little bit after the moment, I guess, that a sperm has penetrated the ovum. And you have the basically the beginnings of life happening right there. Okay. Gametes are going to be reproductive cells, or the sperm and the ova. Each gamete consists of 23 chromosomes. You'll also notice those little tiny dots, okay, around the big, large thing in the center. Those little tiny dots are the sperm. The big, large thing in the center is the egg, right? The ova or the ovum. The package that the mother has, basically with the tools that are available to it, are significantly larger than that of the male. Right, the sperm are significantly smaller. There's less there available, basically. Also interesting, male sperm are slightly smaller than female sperm. So if it's an XY, if it's a sperm carrying an XY chromosome for the a Y chromosome, I guess actually for the last bit, versus the X chromosome, the sperm will be slightly smaller, slightly faster, and slightly less hardy. It'll fade more quickly. If it has an X chromosome, which would lead to becoming a woman, that chromosome, it's a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, has a little bit more to it, and it essentially is a little bit stronger. It can last a little longer within the environment. So within that combinations, there's over 20,000 genes that are going to then guide the development of each, from that single cell, the replication into the billions of cells that we become. So, okay. So how proteins are made, this is also found in the book. You can find it on page 44. I'm actually going to just kind of roll through this, but this is the 4 different types of acids that you'll find, or proteins that you can find that basically the DNA works from. And then they have the example of a chromosome. So you have the cell, basic structures there. You can look in the book, and when you watch the videos, it'll kind of give you some information on that also. But I'm not too worried about this portion yet. So. Slide 6, genetic variations and similarities, part 1. Overall, many genes are identical for every human being. In fact, the vast majority of our genes are going to be exactly the same, right? It's actually less than 1% difference that makes all the differences of all humans on the planet, right? We share the vast majority of our genes in common with each other. That little tiny bit of difference, though, is what basically makes all of the diversity that we have within the human population. So some genes vary slightly in their codes from one person to another, and that's going to be all those differences, right? Skin color, eye color, what kind of hair you got, do you have facial hair, no facial hair, body hair, height, weight, tendencies, genetic health, all those kinds of things. All of those factors, like are you fast, slow, strong, weak, all of those are going to come into play here with those minor gene variations. Okay. An allele is a variation of a gene or any of the possible forms in which a gene for a particular trait can occur. Those slight variants. Effects of variations vary greatly, from causing life-threatening conditions to having no detectable effect at all. So basically, every human being on the planet is going to have some form of an allele within their gene structure. The big thing, and those are basically the things that cause the differences to happen, right? The gene changes with each generation. In the long run, again, if it's strong, if it makes you better, then it's a positive thing, and it increases your chances of survival. If, on the other hand, it is in fact something that can be damaging, then in those cases that can it would basically stop within that generation then, because it generally wouldn't allow the person to make it to the age of reproduction. So, okay. 7, variations among people. So triplets variations. Variations occur because DNA code contains about 3 billion pairs of chemicals organized into triplets. Copy number variations include small variations, mutations, or repetitions in base pairs, not always found in other versions of the same gene. DNA and RNA surrounding the gene enhance, transcribe, connect, silence, regulate, and alter genes through methylation. So basically, this is going to be where it's turning on or turning off essentially each of the individual genes, right? We have 20,000 plus genes. Depending on what combination you have is going to make you, right? It's also going to make you a human versus a chimpanzee or an elephant or a mouse or a blue whale or a banana, right? All these different things. We all share basically the same DNA structure. It just depends on the pattern of which that structure is put into place that makes these vast differences in all living things. This is an image too. You can find this one in the book, I believe, on page 46. It's a small segment basically of one gene. It's a glimpse of a DNA structure, a model of that. Okay. Slide 8. Genetic variations and similarities, part 2. So genes are passed down from generation to generation, right? That's why you have certain traits that are going to look similar to your mother and father, and they're probably going to look similar to their grandparents or their parents, and so on and so forth, back for however many generations, right? A genotype is an organism's genetic inheritance or genetic potential, right? I don't know if we talked about this, but I use an example of an acorn a lot of times with this one, right? In every acorn, assuming that it's fertile, there's the potential for a oak tree, a mighty oak tree. Depending on the environment that it's put into, you might get a better, stronger, or weaker oak tree. But in any case, within each of those, if you give it the perfect environment, it's going to have a potential size and strength and age that oak tree is going to be able to possibly make it to. We're basically the same, right? At the moment of conception, given which sperm happened to make it out of the millions and millions of sperm that are in a single ejaculation, and which egg happens to be available at that time, that combination is going to make you, the specific individual, or anybody on the planet, the specific individual that they are, with the specific potentials available to them, given what is basically put together in that moment. Okay. So it's unique for each organism. Phenotype is the observable characteristics of an organism, including appearance, personality, intelligence, and all other traits. It's all the stuff that makes you, the individual, different than everything else. So it's that specific phenotype, right? Your height, your hair color, your eye color. Are you quiet? Are you loud? All those factors are actually connected to some extent to your DNA, to your genes. Your tendency towards intelligence and all those things, right? And again, there's a potential, right? Doesn't necessarily mean you can meet that potential if your environment doesn't allow it, but there is a potential there for you to be a certain amount. So you might be like, potential genius, but you're in an environment where you don't really get to stretch that, and so that you don't reach that potential in its overall glory, or I guess, or maybe, suffering potentially. But anyway, we'll look at all those things as we go. 9, the human genome, part 1. Genetic diversity, so distinguishes each person. Again, very small differences make very large overall. The overall human population actually shares 99.5. So you could take any two people from anywhere on the planet, and their DNA will be 99.5% identical. That 0.5% difference gives you all the diversity again of all humanity on the planet. So it allows the human species to adapt to pressure of the environment. So climate changes, illnesses, all these things. Basically, as we are extremely flexible, and with that, our diversity helps us with that, right? We find humans everywhere on the planet. They're literally from the Arctic to the hottest deserts and jungles and everything in between. Extremely adaptable to our given environment mentally, but we're also extremely adaptable physically. We can change and alter to some extent over the course of several generations. Darwin really did, on this area, Darwin had to write with the survival of the fittest. If you have stronger genes for a given environment, you have a higher chance of survival. You have a higher chance of getting your genes into the next generation. So, in other words, you have a higher chance of making it to the age where you can actually have kids, is essentially what it is. And then hopefully live long enough to get those kids grown up to where they can have kids. And then at that point, it comes from there. So the genome involves the full set of genes that are the instructions to make an individual member of a certain species. Like I said, similarity between two people is 99.5%. Similarity between humans and chimpanzees is 98%. So 2% difference of genes makes a very big difference in what we look like. There's a similarity between humans and every other mammal. So everything from a blue whale down to a mouse, like a little tiny shrew, we share 90% of the same DNA. I believe we actually share about 70% of the same DNA with a banana. So 30% difference makes a big difference again in that situation. We also share like 40-something% with mushrooms and the like. So there you go. The Human Genome, Part 2, Slide 10. So the Human Genome Project was found only, quote unquote, about 20,000 to 23,000 genes in humans. Right? So you take any individual human, they're going to have somewhere between 20 and 23,000 genes, approximately. This was a huge project that was undertaken in the through the 90s, where they were basically trying to map the genetic code of humanity. The exact number is unknown, but they do know approximately where we land. The first 22 pairs of chromosomes are going to look pretty much identical from the father and from the mother. The 23rd pair is going to be where there's a difference, right? And that is going to be, the difference is going to be the ovum, the egg, will always be an X chromosome. So the mother's side will always be an X chromosome. The father, with the different sperm, like I said, they have an X and a Y. So some of the sperm will have X, some of the sperm will have Y. If it's a Y chromosome, you get a boy. If it's an X chromosome, you get a girl. And that's pretty much how that one works. As far as sexting a child, kind of figuring out which side they roll on. So, yeah. In some cases, actually, even like if doctors are having a hard time kind of figuring out if it's a boy or girl, because there are times where the genitals may not be well developed or things like that. In those cases, what they'll do is actually take a quick blood test and see, do they have an X chromosome or a Y chromosome? And then they mark the sex given that DNA information. So, okay. Slide 11, male and female, part 1. Oops, I kind of got ahead of myself. Humans usually possess 46 chromosomes. Like I said, there are some incidents where there are more or less, but generally speaking, there's going to be 46. 44 autosomes, or they match up, and 2 sex chromosomes. Females are XX, males are XY. Sex of offspring depends on whether the father's Y sperm or X sperm fertilizes the ovum. Quick note. I've heard some people say that, you know, like if you're cold during pregnancy, then you're going to have more likely have a girl or boy or whatever. Okay, or if you get extra hot or these things, that has nothing to do with it. As soon as whichever sperm makes it first to the ovum, and they get connected, and it somehow works its way through the little like shell and gets in there, there's literally a sulfur spark at that moment. And at that moment, you have a brand new cell that has DNA separate from every other living thing on the planet. There's like I said, there's a sulfur spark. It actually literally goes pow, and there's like a little explosion that essentially happens at that instant. Whichever one made it. So if it was a Y chromosome that made it, like the little sperm had a Y chromosome instead of the X, it's male, and vice versa, it's a female. Okay. So, slide 12, male and female, part 2. So this gives you kind of how they can combine. Okay, mother's chromosomes, she has 2 X chromosomes for her final combination. Because if you're a female, you got an X chromosome from your father and an X chromosome from your mother. Each egg can have one or the other of those X chromosomes. Basically, you're passing down the genes from your parents, right? And then your genes are getting passed down through your children and offspring to their children and offspring, and so on and so forth. So you have a chance of 2. Which means you have a total potential combination of 4 different sets, right? You could have a Y from the father or an X from the father. And you can have either of the X's from the mother's lineage, which that's what this image here is showing on slide 12. You can also find this on page 49 with the whole description of it and everything. But yeah, that's going to be different factors there. So we're going to look at genes and how they might influence like how we look and all those kind of things here in a little bit, or a few minutes. But this is a good thing to kind of be aware of. Okay. This can also affect things like if you have the potential for color blindness or things like that. These combinations are what will basically cause you to potentially actually have that or just be a carrier of it. Okay. 13, uncertain sex. So again, the first 22 pairing 22 pairings are basically just, they're going to look identical from the male father and the mother, right? So in this image, we have the showing of those things, right? In the left-hand picture, let me see if I have a picture in the book too, just in case. So yes, on page 50, if you're looking at in the book instead of on the D2L, or instead of on the PowerPoint. On the left-hand side, we have an XY. So if you look at that final pairing, you'll notice that the X is significantly larger than the Y. Okay. On the right-hand side, we have an XX. So what you have here basically is the left-hand side is going to be a male, and the right-hand side is going to be a female. And that's how the DNA works. All right. 14, twins. Twins are fascinating, especially within psychology. They offer a lot of different research potential and opportunities. You have a couple of different forms, and there actually are more levels of twins than just these two, but these two are the most common. Okay, so you have the monozygotic or identical twins. In other words, these are twins who came from the same zygote, a monozygote, right? So you have one zygote. So in other words, you had one ovum, one sperm came together. Cells start replicating. So you go from 1 cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells to 16 cells to 32 cells to 64 cells to 100, okay, so on and so forth. At some point early on, typically, if you have monozygotic twins or identical twins, at some point early on when those cells are splitting, you went 1, 2, 4, 8, let's say, and instead of going 16, it breaks off. And now you have 8 and 8 separate from each other. Okay, they have exactly the same DNA. They're identical twins. Genetically speaking, they are exactly the same. Okay, the environment can have effects upon them, but their genetics are exactly the same. If these people as adults, assuming they both survive, if one of them committed a murder and they found DNA evidence, they would not be able to tell which one actually committed the murder. Okay, their DNA is identical. So incomplete split results in conjoined twins. If the cells begin to break, but they don't quite fully break apart, you have conjoined twins. And in extreme, like there are several relatively extreme cases of that where people were able to survive. There's two young women that they actually have one set of legs. There was a third arm when they were first born, but they surgically removed the third arm. But they share a torso up to here. They each have their own heart. I think they share 3 lungs between the 3 of them, but one has control of one hand and one has control of the other hand, and they can work together amazingly. And they're doing very well. They've actually just recently graduated from college. They have become teachers, and they're doing really well with it. But that would be a conjoined twin, right? Like it wasn't fully separated. A lot of times you'll see people like they might be connected like at the hip or something, and it's a relatively easy surgical procedure to separate those twins in those cases. With those kinds of more extreme ones, in order to remove one twin from the other, basically they have to kill one of the twins, and so they chose not to do that. Same genotype, but slight variations in phenotype are possible due to environmental influences, right? If I had 2 identical twins and I gave one a diet that was one way and one a diet a different way, they might look a little different, even though the genetics are the same because of the differences in environment. Okay. Dizygotic or fraternal twins. So dizygotic means you have 2 ovum. Each ovum is fertilized by separate sperm. And this results in basically having 2 babies in the womb at the same time who are not identical genetically. They just happen to be in the womb at the same time. So it results from fertilization of 2 separate ova by 2 separate sperm. It is technically possible to have fraternal twins who have different fathers, technically. If the mother sleeps or has intercourse with 2 separate men very close together, and if there's 2 ovum available at that time, one man's sperm can technically fertilize one egg, and another man's sperm could fertilize the other egg at the same time, and they'd be in the womb at the same time together. And it could be like within a day or 2 of each other doing this. Dizygotic twins have half their genes in common and occur twice as often as monozygotic twins. It's going to look genetically, assuming it's the same, if it is the same dad, genetically speaking, they're going to look the exact same closeness-wise as any brothers and sisters would, right? Incidence is genetic and varies by ethnicity and age. Some people are more likely to have, so if you have twins that run in your family, right? Like you're like, oh well, I have like 3 aunts that all had twins, and my grandma had twins, and blah blah. Okay, there's a pretty decent chance that you might have twins at that point if you're the woman. The father doesn't matter. The father, his offspring may or may not be more or less likely to have twins, but whoever the father is having intercourse with, it doesn't affect their chances of twins. It is, on this case, it's down to the mother's genetics. So, okay. So monozygotic, identical twins, twins from the same ovum and sperm connected and created that first break apart. Dizygotic, two babies that happen to be in the womb at the same time, but are otherwise they're related just as any brother and sister are, but they're not genetically identical. And that's what it comes down to. Okay, 15, genetic interactions part 1. Almost every trait is polygenic, affected by many genes, right? 20,000+ genes, depending on which ones are turned on and turned off, and the combination of those are going to make all of the different things happen. And also multifactorial, influenced by many factors. There's going to be all kinds of different environmental factors and the like that are going to cause some to turn on and turn off, and it's going to affect all those different outcomes. Okay, and it can be everything from different substances that are in the environment when you're first conceived. If the mother is like a smoker or an alcoholic or on drugs or things like that, those substances or even just like a heavy coffee drinker, those substances potentially can have an effect upon how the genes represent themselves in the individual upon as they develop in the womb. Regulator genes direct the interactions of other genes, controlling their genetic expression, duplication, and transcription. These are basically like the foremen on a site, right? They're controlling kind of where things are going, and it's what makes the cell go. You have to start with one cell. And from that one cell, you have the diversity of what is human. So you have all our nervous system, our brain, our heart, our muscles, our bones, all the cells, blood cells, everything that we are is going to be from originally those initial cells. Sorry, I have the hiccups a little bit. All right. They're responsible for differences between species, right? These are what basically tell your genes or your cells to become human and not a monkey or a dog or whatever, an oak tree. That's going to be the cases there. Okay, 16. Genetic interactions part 2. Additive genes add something to some aspect of the phenotype, add up to make the overall phenotype. So all these little additive genes combined make you look like what you look like, basically, and act how you act, and all of those factors. 17, dominant and recessive heredity. A dominant gene is far more influential than the recessive gene or non-additive. So dominant genes, for example, are going to be, most people are have brown eyes in the world, right? Because brown eyes are going to be a dominant gene. The blue eye tendency is actually a recessive gene. It's a gene that's weaker. And so therefore it is less likely, if you have a brown-eyed parent and a blue-eyed parent, they are significantly more likely to have a brown-eyed child. Technically, even if you have two blue-eyed parents, you have a decent chance of still having a brown-eyed child, because oftentimes the gene for brown eyes is still present within their genome, their whole little setup. And then we come together, because it's stronger, it'll override and give their child brown eyes. Sometimes it doesn't, but that's usually the case. Okay. Let's see. Dominant gene can completely control the phenotype with no noticeable effect of the recessive genes. An effect of recessive genes can sometimes be noticed, such as blue eyes. Right. And that's a simple one. There are literally thousands of possibilities of dominant and recessive genes. Blue eyes are just one that are fairly obvious for most people. Genetic interactions part 3, so slide 18. Carrier. It's a person whose genotype includes a gene that is not expressed in the phenotype. So the genotype is what's potentially there in your genes. The phenotype is what is actually expressed within the individual. So a carrier is somebody who has something hidden in their genes, basically, but it's not expressed within them. Okay, so unexpressed gene occurs in half of the carrier's gametes and is passed on to half of the carrier's offspring. So the mother, let's say the unexpressed one is the X chromosome, for example, from the father. So if the ovum, the little egg, is from the mother's side, it's not there. If it's from the mother's father's side, it is. Okay, it's present. But then if you have an X chromosome from the now father, that one may override that one, and so it continues to be hidden. If you have a Y chromosome, it will express itself in that child. So offspring can be carrier or express the gene in the phenotype when an unexpressed gene is inherited by both parents. For example, slide 19, looking at color blindness. So color blindness is an excellent example of how this can happen. You can also find this on page 54 within our book, this little or graph here. But it's the chances of color blindness. So color blindness is going to be an actual, like a little tweak on the 23rd pairing, is an X-linked gene shift, basically. So if you have an XX chromosome, neither of those chromosomes are carrying the color blindness shift. You have a typical woman, she's not a carrier, and she has no color blindness herself. If she's XY, again, neither of those have color blindness. Typical man, typical X from the mother, no color blindness. If they're an XX with one of the X's being a carrier, okay, you have a typical woman. That woman is a carrier from her father, in this case. Half of her children will inherit her X. The girls with her X will be carriers. They will not be colorblind. They will be carriers. The boys with her X will be colorblind. Okay. You flip-flop the XX, same exact thing, except she's a carrier from the mother instead of the father. And in this case, again, the daughters will not be colorblind, but the sons will. XY, you have a colorblind man, guaranteed. Okay, inherited from the mother. All of his daughters will have his X. None of his sons will have his X. So all of his children will have normal vision unless their mother also has an X for color blindness. If you have a person who somehow has an X and an X from both sides, so both sides had that X chromosome that is a color blindness, you have a colorblind woman. It's extremely rare. Inherited from both parents. Every child will have one X from her. Therefore, every son will have color blindness. Daughters will only be carriers unless they also inherit an X from the father, as their mother did. And so if you have a woman who is colorblind, all of her sons are guaranteed to be colorblind also. Okay. So this kind of gives you, hopefully, kind of gives you an idea of kind of how that works, right? How that shows itself. All right, shifting gears, slide 20, from zygote to newborn. And this is where the video that you're going to be watching also, looking at conception to birth, kicks in. Okay, so we have three main periods of prenatal development. We have the germinal period, the embryonic period, and the fetal period. The germinal period is the first 2 weeks after conception. So this is kind of the most risky time for those cells. Like there's a high chance of the woman naturally aborting the child, right? Like it just won't, something won't go wrong and it's not going to make it. Okay. You have rapid cell division happening just within literally hours of conception happening. Embryonic period is from the 3rd week approximately to the 8th week. Okay. Basic forms of all body structures will develop during that first 8 weeks. You're going to have the fingers, you're going to have toes, your eyes, all of the organs will be in place. They're not going to be very well developed yet, but they'll be technically functioning to some extent. Okay, like the heart will start beating and all this kind of stuff in this period. The brain, and then finally the fetal period, which is the 9th week until birth. This is basically you have the fully developed, fetus, the little baby. And at 9 weeks, it's basically just gaining size and gaining strength, so that all those organs will then be able to sustain life outside of the womb. Okay. All right. Next slide, slide 21. Germinal period, first 14 days. So zygote begins duplication and division within hours of conception. So again, it goes from 1 cell to 2, and then 2 to 4, and then 4 to 8, and then 8 to 16, and then 16 to 32, and then 32 to 64, and then 64 to 128, and then so on and so forth. Okay. That's how you can go from 1 cell to millions and billions relatively quickly, right, in the course of less than a year. Implantation about 10 days after conception. So the little zygote is going to basically be floating in the environment, and it's literally just going to kind of loose in there. Approximately 10 days after conception, it will embed itself in the wall of the in the womb, basically. Okay. And the placenta will begin to form. So the placenta organism grows rapidly at that point. The developing embryo is then attached to the wall of the uterus in there. That's where the umbilical cord will basically embed itself, and they'll nourish the organism through and also get rid of all the waste and everything in that period. Okay, so the little baby's basically going to be getting its nutrition from the mother as well as cleaning itself out through the mother as well, and then the mother's body flushes her own bloodstream and cleans everything out. The placenta is going to be an organ basically that is going to line the uterus in this point, and that's going to be where it's essentially feeding that little baby. Okay, slide 22. This is an image of the divisions within the cells. This is also typically, if you're going to have monozygotic twins, the identical twins, somewhere in this early stages where you're going to have that split happen where you have suddenly it goes from 1 to 2 people who are genetically identical. Okay. 23. The embryonic period from the 3rd through the 8th weeks. So the embryo, primitive streak, becomes the neural tube and later forms the brain and spine of the central nervous system. If you ever see a CNS, like you have here on this slide, in psychology at least, that stands for central nervous system. The head will take shape, so you go from looking like a little weird alien gummy bear thing to actually looking like a person to some extent. Our eyes, ears, nose, and mouth will all form. Heart begins to pulsate at this point to the point where you can actually like hear it, not like just naked ear, but with a stethoscope and stuff, and it's measurable. Extremities develop and webbed fingers and toes separate into actual little, our hands and everything. Okay, at the end of this period, we actually have all the fingernails and everything are in place, are starting to grow. 24. This is an image at 4 weeks. Past conception, the embryo is only about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters long. Okay, tiny little guy. Kind of look like a little alien at this stage, right? But you have the beginnings of everything. So you can see the spinal column forming. That little like blob thing at the end, at the top there, is going to be the head eventually. And you have the organs beginning to form there in the body. You also have the little like buds showing up that'll turn into the hands and the feet. The second picture on the right there is 7 weeks. Okay, so you go from 4 weeks to 7 weeks. We go from there to there, where we actually start to look like a little person, maybe like a little person mixed with a gummy bear, but still a little person. With this one, you can see those little things that look like olives there are the eyes. The fingers and toes are beginning to separate. You can see the stomach, and you can also see the umbilical cord connected there to the infant. You can actually see these pictures on page 57 in case you're following with the book and not the PowerPoint. Okay. 25. Fetal period from 9th week until birth. Again, the fetus at this point, genitals form, and sex hormones will cause differences in fetal brain organization. So every single person on the planet, initially upon conception, is actually on the path to become a woman. Okay, the preset pathway is female. With that Y chromosome, what this is going to do at approximately the beginning of this period, the 9th week, that Y chromosome is going to flip a switch. The mother's body will basically flood the fetus with hormones. These hormones are actually going to go in and attack the brain of the developing baby, kill part of it, and restructure it, and then continue the growing in its new pathway. A male brain is actually simpler in some ways than a female brain, which is interesting. So yeah, there's a legitimate biological difference between how a male's brain is wired and a female's brain is wired. At about 3 months, the fetus weighs about 3 ounces, not very much, teeny tiny still, right? Experiences the period of greatest brain growth during the 4th, 5th, and 6th months. With that, it's extremely important that the mother has things that aren't going to be affecting the brain negatively, as well as having things in her diet that are needed. So all the fats and things that are needed for the brain to fully develop in this period. Okay. At this point, you can legitimately hear the heartbeat, the separate heartbeat of the fetus with just a stethoscope. It doesn't take any kind of special tools or anything to recognize it. So beyond that. Something also to be aware of. A lot of doctors actually argue that we have trimesters, right? We have like these 3 different periods of development. A lot of doctors argue that we should have 4 trimesters, right? The human is not actually fully developed at the point where they can like do pretty good compared to other animals upon birth. And for the first 3 months after birth, we basically continue to act as if we were still in the womb. Right? There's lots of sleeping. The brain activity looks similar to what animals would look like when they're in the womb. But if we were to go a full year rather than 9 months of pregnancy, basically 99.9% of babies' heads would be too big to fit through the birth canal, and so with that, you'd have a very high chance of death. So there's a lot of doctors feel like it's actually like kind of a survival mode, which we give birth a little bit early, essentially earlier than we should technically, but it allows us to give birth safely-ish. Right, it's still dangerous to some extent, but it's still comparatively safe. And then we continue to develop outside the womb. So the brain and our senses and everything else are still very underdeveloped at birth, even after this 9-month period. Okay, 26. Fetal period, age of viability, age at which a preterm newborn may survive outside the mother's uterus is if medical care is available. At this point, the earliest after conception that a fetus has any chance of surviving outside of the womb, so a little baby will make it, is 22 weeks. Okay, that may change in the future, but at this point, and even then, it's a tough one, right? The closer you get to the full 40 weeks, the better. 38 weeks is considered kind of like that you're fully developed at that point and can survive outside the womb without extreme medical care in most cases. So 38 to 40 is the kind of the go-to for most people. Some cultures actually 42 weeks is what's expected, but 38 pretty much across the board, no matter where you're on the planet, 38 is going to be considered like the minimum for full development. The brain is able to regulate basic body functions such as breathing at 22 weeks though, and the lungs potentially, again, with proper medical care and everything and all the things available to them, they can give enough power to keep air going. Okay. All right, let's see. 27, problems and solutions. So chromosomal anomalies. About once in every 200 births, an infant is born with 45, 47, or even 48 or 49 chromosomes, which produces different syndromes. The most common condition is Down syndrome, which is trisomy 21. With that, basically, and that's an additional chromosome. About 1 in every 500 infants is born with only 1 sex chromosome. So you have an X chromosome, but no X or Y from the father. Or in some cases with 3 chromosomes or more, even in some cases. And that can potentially have no effect, or it potentially can have serious effects depending on how they express themselves and things. Okay. But yeah, that's a fairly common thing. I mean, you look at how many millions of little sperm. There's a pretty decent chance that some of them aren't going to be quite fully developed or doing how they should. And if they happen to be the one that makes it first, then that's what you get. Okay. 28, abnormal genes, gene disorders. So the phenotype is only affected when the inherited gene is dominant or when both parents carry the recessive gene. Most dominant disorders begin in adulthood. Fatal dominant childhood conditions cannot be passed on, right? If it kills you when you're a kid, those genes aren't going to make it. So generally speaking, what these disorders are is they don't affect you until you get into adulthood, after you had kids. And at that point, they kick in. Recessive disorders are more common. And examples of these are going to be like Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, thalassemia, sickle cell disease, and Fragile X. Now, interestingly, what you're going to find is there's going to be some of these are going to be found in different regions more regularly, right? Such as sickle cell. If you have African descent, so if you're from the continent of Africa originally, your ancestors were, you have a much higher chance of having sickle cell. Cystic fibrosis is going to be more likely to occur if you're from Northern Europe, and so that's a big one. The reason for this, if I remember the diseases correctly, sickle cell disease basically is an advantage if you lived in Africa, especially in the older days, because it essentially makes you immune to malaria. Okay, the malaria virus basically can't do anything with the difference in cells, and so it just dies out. So you basically can't get malaria. It can cause problems in the long run, but as a child and the like, there's usually not any real evident problems. And it keeps you from getting malaria, which is a potentially deadly disease, and so therefore you have a higher chance of surviving to adulthood, where you could have offspring. Cystic fibrosis, same kind of a thing. Doesn't typically show itself until early to mid adulthood, but it makes you immune to cholera. Essentially, does the same kind of a thing. The cholera viruses can't affect the body the way it should, but it also allows your body to basically kind of attack itself to some extent. So yeah, those are going to be the keys there. Okay, next slide, 29. Genetic counseling. Professionals who provide genetic counseling help prospective parents understand the genetic risk so that they can make informed decisions, not impulsive, irrational ones. Basically, what these are is you'll go in, they do blood work, they look at your DNA, and they see what are the chances of your children having some kind of a genetic disorder, given your genes and your potential other person's genes that you're going to be making a baby with, and so they can give you the odds with that one. And then therefore you can, if this is probably a good idea if there are certain things that run in your family, or if there are certain things that run in your potential spouse's family, it's a decent idea to get it checked just to see what are the odds of it occurring within your children. Okay. 30, prenatal harm, teratogens. Any agent or condition, including viruses and drugs, resulting in birth defects or complications. If you've ever had children before, when you go to the doctor for the first time, you discover that almost everything, literally, can be a teratogen, right? Cleaning the cat box can expose you to teratogens. Certain herbs, if you take too many of them, becomes a teratogen. Caffeine is a teratogen, right? They have an effect that can potentially cause a defect in within the baby. There's a lot of cleaning agents and things that are at best questionable. You got to avoid ibuprofen. I mean, it's ridiculous. Garlic, too much garlic can cause issues. And it can be, everything from physical defects to mental developmental defects. Behavioral teratogens are going to be those things that affect those. So agents and conditions that can harm the prenatal brain, impairing the future child's intellectual and emotional functioning. Fetal alcohol syndrome is going to be an example of that if the mother is drinking during pregnancy. It can impact this. That's a behavioral teratogen, essentially. Okay. Like next slide, 31, alcohol, genes, prenatal health. So alcohol, embryos exposed to mother's heavy drinking can develop fetal alcohol syndrome, which causes decrease in potential IQs, emotional issues, and just overall ability to control oneself is generally diminished significantly. All right, 32, innate vulnerability, genetic vulnerability. So some zygotes carry genes that make them vulnerable, right? Male fetuses are more vulnerable to teratogens than female ones. Generally speaking, male fetuses are actually going to be significantly weaker than female ones all along the way. Even in adulthood, the male body is weaker to outside sources to some extent, okay? To some extent. So like basically the male immune system typically is not as strong as the typical female immune system. But we can be impacted by these things more negatively and things like that. Okay. Neural tube defects are more common in certain ethnic groups, such as Irish, English, and Egyptian. So if you have background in those areas, you might, you want to make sure that the mother is getting enough of different minerals and different vitamins and things to make sure that she's able to reduce the chances of this as much as possible. Okay. 33, making predictions and reducing risks. We actually have a video on that you can watch too. If you look down in the video section this week's thing, that looks at birth defects and kind of how they affect us. So I think it's a 20 to 30 minute-ish video looking at that. It's a really good one though. So making predictions, reducing risk. General maternal health is protective, right? If the mother is healthy and eating well and all these things, then generally speaking, that you're providing the best environment possible for the developing child. Scrutinize more closely herbal medicine or over-the-counter drugs. Again, everything potentially can be a teratogen. So Don't just take things that are like, well, I've been taking it forever, so it shouldn't bother. Well, yeah, you know. Learn about effects of psychoactive drugs and alcohol. If you're on antidepressants or things like that, or anti-anxiety pills, that's something to talk to your doctor about, if just to see how, if and or how it will affect your children. Use the internet-based health information cautiously. Hopefully, everyone's realized that with every category, right? If you ever, you're like, oh, I got the sniffles, I wonder what I have, and you go on and like, oh, you're dying of cancer, or something like that. Take it with a grain of salt, right? And also do the same kind of things that you would do when you're writing a paper, right? Like, look at the source. Is it a solid source? Is it have a strong history? Is it trustworthy, right? Is it Joe Schmo down the road, or is it actually somebody who knows what they're talking about? And so you need to always take it with a grain of salt when you're looking at internet-based health information. 34. Preterm or slow growing. Preterm birth that occurs at 35 or fewer weeks after conception. So if you're born before 35 weeks, you're considered preterm. Usually associated with low birth weight, right? It's kind of like no duh, because you might be developing right on track, but you're born early, so therefore your birth weight is lower than it would have been if you had made it to the full 40 weeks or 38 weeks. Small for gestational age, or SGA, is going to be the birth weight is significantly lower than expected given the time since conception. Suggests impairment throughout prenatal development and potentially serious problems. Okay, not a guarantee. It might be perfectly fine, but it's a big red flag basically for the medical field that they need to be checking to make sure that these things aren't there. All right. First random fact. Sorry, kind of forgot about it. First random fact, 2009. Stephen Hawking held a party for time travelers, but didn't publicize it until after, so only time travelers would know about it. Unfortunately, nobody showed up, so other than Stephen Hawking. So, random fact. Stephen Hawking had a party for time travelers. No one showed up. 2009. Okay. 35. This is where we're going to be giving you the different levels of birth weight, right? Low birth weight is less than 2,500 grams or 5.5 pounds. So if you're above 5.5 grams, you're considered a normal birth weight, okay, at birth. Very low birth weight, or VLBW, is under 1,500 grams or 3 pounds 5 ounces. Again, if you're born at like 30 weeks or something like that, there's a much higher chance of falling into that category. Extremely low birth weight, or ELBW, it's under 1,000 grams or 2 pounds 3 ounces at birth. In the United States, interestingly enough, they found that there's actually a decrease in low birth weight over the past 25 years, which is good, right? We don't want to have a low birth weight. 8% of newborns are seriously underweight in the United States, though, still, at least as of a couple of years ago. If you are low birth weight, you are significantly more susceptible to teratogens, and there's also higher birth risks overall. So basically the bigger the baby, the better they're going to do overall in the whole process. I have a friend that had a 12-pound baby, and I was like, my goodness, like that looks extremely painful. But at the same time, the baby was very chubby and very healthy and very happy for the first several months of its life. Continued to be happy and relatively chubby throughout most of its childhood, but yeah, weight makes a difference, basically. Okay. Low birth weight part 2, slide 36. Maternal behavior. So maternal health and illnesses can affect this. Maternal drug use before and during pregnancy can also have a pretty significant impact upon the child's development, right? You hear about like meth babies and things like that, and that can be a definite negative impact upon the development of the child. Maternal malnutrition is going to be a big one. If the mother doesn't have all the vitamins and minerals and everything that's needed, all the fats and all that kind of stuff, the baby likely will struggle to develop properly and will have a much higher chance of being born with a low birth weight. Fathers and others are also going to have an impact on this. They found that fathers' attitudes and behaviors have a very significant impact upon the overall health and birth weight of the child. So if the fathers are more supportive and are like excited about it and are doing everything they can to help, oftentimes the outcome is that the child will also be more well developed in the womb. there's an immigrant paradox that the book talks about. Let me see what we got. Sorry, here we go. Overall health, expected advice. Doesn't really matter that much in the book. Anyway, immigrant paradox is it's a surprising discovery that although low socioeconomic usually correlates with poor health, it's not true for Hispanics in the United States. Okay, so when you compare the U.S. average low birth weight rate, they found that Hispanic newborns are less often low birth weight, and we don't exactly know why. My guess, and this is extremely true for those that are you're coming up north in the United States, first generation kind of things. My guess, even though they're lower income and they fall into this lower socioeconomic status, I'm guessing that the choices of food is going to be one of the big factors there, right? They might be low income, so they're eating quote unquote poorly, but they're eating things like beans and rice and tortillas and things that offer much more nutrition and the like that their body needs, versus Americans' tendency in other groups to eat things like ramen noodles and mac and cheese that have significantly less health benefits than those simple beans and rice do. Okay, just a guess. Honestly, again, we don't actually know, but that's my educated guess on that one. So 37, and before we do that, we're going to do the next random fact. There's no period in Dr. Pepper. So there's no, DR, there's no period after the DR. Because it looked like DI Pepper in the old logo's font. So they changed it up to have, so it's just DR Pepper with no dot. Random. Okay. High-risk infants and children. So consequences of low birth weight, again, slide 37. High-risk infants and children, every developmental accomplishment is late, typically. Okay. Children that are born low weight will cry more, they pay attention less, they disobey more, and experience language and developmental outcome delays, right? They do it significantly later, typically, than your average child. So middle childhood, formerly SGA children, have more neurological problems, smaller brain volume, which is a big potential issue. Okay. Remember, risk analysis gives odds, not guarantees. You could be born at 2 pounds, nothing, and have no problems whatsoever. You could be born chubby and have all kinds of issues, but there's a higher risk of it. Basically, it's a red flag, right? It gives you like we need to keep an eye on things if you fall into this category. Okay. Next slide, or next fact. Next slide also, but then next fact first. They have discovered sharks living in an active underwater volcano, but no one can investigate due to the heat and acidity of the water causing immediate burns to anyone who tries to dive with them. They don't really know much about these sharks because basically they can't go in and explore it. So interesting stuff. How do they live there? We don't know. We can't explore it. So there you go. Okay. Sharks living in volcanoes. Weird stuff. Slide 38, low birth weights comparing nations. United States has a low birth weight rate of about 8%, like I already mentioned a little bit ago, ranking worse than most developed nations. Okay, so we're improving. We've improved to 8%, but we're still doing worse than most nations, developed nations around the world. Worldwide, far fewer low birth weight babies are born today than 20 years ago, which is excellent. Again, we're basically avoiding all of those potential issues for the most part, or at least reducing them. Neonatal deaths have been reduced by 1/3 as a result. So for every 3 babies that would have died, statistically now only 2 die, which again, we're on the right path with that. Okay. I have a little side note here. Getting better. When all nations are included, 47 report LBW at 6 per 100, so 6%. Or lower, which suggests that many nations, including the United States and United Kingdom, could improve national health since both are affected by the same causes. Okay. Slide 39, a view from science, international comparisons. So as you can see in this whole thing, and this is also going to be found in the book. Let's see if I can find it. You're going to find the view from science on page 69, along with that detailed little breakdown here. This is the chances of food insecurity by household type from 2001 to 2016. Single mothers are the most likely to struggle with food insecurity, where they are not 100% sure where they're going to get the next meals. Single fathers are the next most likely group, and married parents are the least likely to struggle with food insecurity. Which makes sense, right? A single parent is basically having to do everything, and with that, it increases the chances of financial struggles. Where if you have married parents, you have two people that are kind of sharing the load. That also is potentially two incomes coming in, and so with that, it reduces the chances of having that struggle with where is that food coming from, kind of thing. So, all right. I would recommend reading that article, though, that view from science, because it does give you some good scientific thinking and the like, kind of how you would look at that information and analyze it. Okay, slide 40, birth. Fetal brain signals the release of hormones to trigger the female's uterine muscles. Okay, baby's like, time to go, and they start triggering things. Labor begins at that point. Average duration for firstborn babies is 12 hours, and it gets quicker labor for later born babies. Basically, each baby down the road, it gets faster and faster and faster. I have a friend who, actually have some friends, I should say, a husband-wife couple who've had 9 kids together. They live relatively rural, so there's some distance from them to the hospital. The last few children they decided to have at home because they basically couldn't make it to the hospital in time. Like, it was getting fast. This last child that they had, the midwife couldn't make it, so the father actually delivered the baby on his own. Luckily, he had already delivered, like they'd already done 8 babies, so he kind of knew what he was doing. But yeah, it gets faster and faster. It took her less than an hour to give birth. It was like 23 minutes, I think it was, from when it was like, oh, here we go, into having the baby. The APGAR scale is a quick assessment of newborn's heart rate, breathing, muscle tone, color, and reflexes. So it's completed twice. They do it once at 1 minute. Basically, baby's born, they clean it off. They do a quick rundown of these things, making they're looking at the skin color and all that kind of stuff. They do it again at 5 minutes. They give a score of 0, 1, or 2 in each category. The desired score is at least a 7. Okay. There's a possibility of scoring a 10. Almost no baby will score a 10, ever. Like, it's extremely rare. But you're wanting at least a 7. 7 shows that they're healthy and everything is going well. If it falls below a 7, if you get a 6 or less, basically that's a red flag, and you're going to be watching and making sure everything is going well, and or potentially taking action to turn things around. Right. You also don't want a 0 in any category. That you got some issues going if you got a 0. So, all right, 41. A normal, uncomplicated birth. The picture here you can also find on page 72. And it basically just shows the whole process. So the baby's position at the birth process begins in image A there. Image B, the first stage of labor. Cervix dilates and allows passage of the baby's head, right? You also notice the cervix, there's a little plug initially there that basically keeps bacteria and all that kind of stuff out. That little plug will fall out a couple days before, typically, because the cervix begins to expand, and as it expands, it releases that cork and little mucus plug. C, transition, the baby's head moves into the birth canal or of the vagina. D, the second stage of labor, the baby's head moves through the opening of the vagina and crowns. You get a little like, whoop, right? And then emerges completely, followed by the rest of the body about a minute later. Once the head makes it through, it's a fast process generally. The head is definitely the hardest part. We got giant heads. As humans, we have huge heads at birth compared to the rest of our body. And so that's one of the reasons why it's actually relatively dangerous for women to give birth. And that's why so many women died in the past giving birth. We have these big old heads that don't always want to make it out. Third stage of labor is the expulsion of the placenta. This usually occurs naturally, but it is crucial that the whole placenta be expelled, so birth attendants check carefully. In some cultures, the placenta is ceremonially buried to commemorate the life-giving role it played. The placenta also oftentimes can be different groups will eat it. Everything from like they'll cook it to just eating it raw. There's more and more people today in the Western world and the more developed countries that are choosing to consume it, but they're taking it and they're drying it or turning it into a tincture. So they're taking it like in pill form or in like a liquid format. And they have found that it actually does help with women's hormone balances after birth, because hormones can kind of be all over the place after giving birth for quite a while. They've also it reduces the impact of baby blues, which we'll talk about, and it also can just help with like milk production, and there's all kinds of different things that it potentially can help with. So if you can get, it's one of those, I guess if you can get past like the U factor, it can be beneficial. So, 42, medical intervention, part 1. Infant mortality has decreased due to better medical care, right? Childbirth has become safer for mothers. Again, it's not the life-threatening thing that it used to be. It's potentially dangerous, but it's down significantly from what it was in the past. And then excessive medical care can also have some disadvantages. For example, the next slide, 43, cesarean section or C-section. It's a surgical birth, right? They surgically remove the baby by basically cutting open the belly and taking the baby out. Fetus can be removed very quickly, which is an advantage. And it's usually safe for the mother and baby, saving lives when the fetal head is too large for the pelvis, which is a common thing. Not super common, but common enough to be an issue. Baby's got too big a head, it can't fit, right? And so because that in the past, the mother and the child would have died. Today they can do a C-section and save the baby. About 1/3 of births in the United States are through C-section today. Richer countries typically are going to have a higher tendency towards using C-sections compared to the poorer countries. Basically, poorer countries are going to do it when it legitimately is an emergency. In the richer countries, it might be like scheduled because it's convenient. And that's going to be some of the different factors there, right? Doctors who are going to do C-sections, it allows them to literally be like, okay, on this date at this time, you come in, I do a quick surgery, and we're good to go, rather than being called at like 3 o'clock in the morning and being like, baby's coming, kind of a thing. Which leads us to a question, slide 44. Too many cesareans or too few? So rates of cesarean deliveries vary widely from nation to nation. The underlying issue is whether some women who should have cesareans do not get them, while other women have unnecessary cesareans. So, for example, down in Chad, in Africa, the country of Chad, only about 2% of births are through cesarean section. And it's likely that actually more women should probably have had a cesarean section, but weren't able to, because it might have been hours and hours and hours to the nearest hospital. On the flip-flop of that, in Chile, the country of Chile, approximately 50% of births are through cesarean section, which means that more than likely unless they have some serious issues going on, that many women should not be needing a cesarean section. So it might be being overused. Okay. And that can, cesarean sections it's a surgical procedure, right? They're cutting you open. It can actually cause some issues with like the bonding of the child, because if you have a natural birth, you lay the baby on your belly, but your belly now has stitches and stuff in it, so that's not really an option. So breastfeeding can become more challenging, and connecting to the baby emotionally can actually become more challenging with a C-section. It's doable, but more challenging. Not to mention just the fact that you've had a surgery, like they actually cut you open, and so therefore there's healing time and everything that's going to be issued there as well. 45, traditional and modern birthing practices. So the two ways, which have always been the case, or have been the case for the most part, are home births and hospital births. Home births are actually gaining in popularity in today's culture. It's still by far the minority, but some people are choosing to do it, with the midwives and the like, for the lowering the stress of being at home versus being in a hospital setting. Again, factors there. Disadvantage: if anything goes wrong, you don't have all of the medical facilities right there at hand, so you can be in trouble if something were to go bad. Hospital births are today the most popular. One tool that is being used in both home births and hospital births is this doula. So a doula is a woman who helps with labor, delivery, breastfeeding, and newborn care. They basically are somebody who they kind of come in. They're experts in the birthing process, although they're not midwives themselves. But they can help with basically navigating all of this, and they kind of help you with like what to expect and getting you through, like reducing the stress, help you with the delivery. They're usually trained to some extent in breastfeeding and things, so they can help the mother, the new mother, with getting a firm latch with the baby, which is actually more challenging than one might think. And they've done some experiments with this to kind of see how if it works. And what they found, it may be related to lower rates of cesarean sections. They gave they chose random mothers who were giving birth, or getting ready to give birth, and some of them they assigned a doula, and some of them they didn't. And what they found is that the mothers, they had a significant reduction in the need of a cesarean section with the mothers who were assigned doulas than those who were not. And so it lends itself to looking like the doula might help with reducing the need of cesarean sections. Okay. Mostly because of the reduction in stress and things that the doula is trained in to kind of help the mother relax. Okay, slide 46, the new family, the newborn. Brazelton Neonatal Behavioral Assessment Scale records 46 behaviors, including 20 reflexes. Reflex is an unlearned involuntary action or movement in response to a stimulus. A reflex occurs without conscious thought. For example, if I go like this at your eye, you're going to flinch, right? And that flinch is the reflex, right? The eye squinting without, you don't have to be like, all right, eyes squint. It just happens. Okay. If I tap your elbow and your elbow like shoots out, or if I tap your knee, they're checking your reflexes, right? You don't have to think about it. If I prick you with a needle, you're going to pull away. That's a reflex. So they're going to be checking reflexes with the grip and like seeing how the feet work and all those kinds of things. They're wanting to basically make sure that everything is going well with that. Okay, new family mothers, slide 47, postpartum depression. Many women experience significant physical problems after birth. Problems include such things as incisions from a C-section, painfully sore nipples, or problems with urination, right? You just squeezed the baby out, so there's going to be some issues there, potentially. Psychological symptoms range from baby blues to postpartum psychosis. So baby blues is going to be just kind of a general drop in mood. You just kind of feel bummed, right? A little bit blue. And it's generally connected to you have a significant hormonal shift happening with the whole birthing process, and then your body's trying to get back into equilibrium, that balance of hormones. But it takes several weeks typically for that to happen. Postpartum psychosis is where this potential for kind of like low end becomes extreme. Okay, in its most extreme, it can actually lead to the mother looking at committing suicide and or hurting her children. Like even to the point of killing their child. And so that's something for the father and for other people around them to kind of keep an eye on. It's very rare at that level. So about 8 to 15% of women are going to feel some sense of the kind of baby blues and sadness and inadequacy after birth, I think that would be something that would be nice if people knew about. Postpartum psychosis, where it gets to that extreme, is much less likely to happen. Okay. But this can set in both the lighter baby blues to the postpartum psychosis can set in even weeks after the birth has actually happened. And so just be aware of that. Kind of be if you're the mother, be aware of that. If you're someone taking care of a mother, be aware of that. Keep an eye out for it. Basically, may involve struggles with adequate baby care. Right? If you're struggling with depression, it's very difficult to take care of yourself, let alone a brand new baby. So that's something to be aware of. And there's all kinds of different causes of why it might be. Right? It could be the stress and lack of sleep, which is pretty darn common after when you have a brand new baby. It could be, just the struggles of trying to figure out how to take care of a baby. It could be the hormones. It could be, there's so many different factors there that can cause this. All right. Last random fact. Swedish meatballs originated from a recipe King Charles XII brought back from Turkey in the early 1800s. I don't know why they don't call them Turkish meatballs, but Swedish meatballs are in the 1800s from King Charles XII. Random fact. Okay. Last slide, slide 48. New family, the father. The father's role. So helping mothers stay healthy. Fathers actually have they found that there's a significant impact for mothers who have a supportive male figure in their life, right? The father of the child. The role of the father in this state is basically to help keep the mother healthy. So they're making sure the mother's getting the food they need. They're watching the mother after, especially right after the birth, to make sure that they're kind of, they're not struggling too much with the baby blues and the like. They can help mothers manage stress, which affects the fetus. So throughout the entire period of the pregnancy, if the mother the hormones that are produced with stress are actually a teratogen of themselves. So if the mother's overly stressed, there can be some serious negative effects upon the child's development. So reducing that stress is a very good thing. And so that's one of the things that the father can do. One odd thing that some fathers have is experiencing kavade in some cultures. I did not experience this myself when my wife gave birth. But essentially, this is where the father experiences basically the same symptoms of birthing, including all of the pains and everything that go along with it, alongside the mother. So some cultures actually see this as expected, this is the kind of the norm, right? Other cultures would consider this somewhat pathological. It's like, what's wrong with you, dude? My wife told me when I told her about this thing being a thing, and my wife told me that she would punch me if I experienced kavade. She's like, "Have you ever not helped me do this?" Okay, so she didn't sound like that. That's just how I sound. But anyway, kavade is an interesting little side thing that can happen for some people. So yeah, and that is pretty much that chapter in a nutshell. So again, chapter went a little bit longer than I was hoping it was going to go, but hopefully it's not too long. You watch this. Watch the video looking at In the Womb. It's a fascinating little video. Really worth the time to watch it. Gives a lot of information and details. And like I said, the footage of it is just incredible. They actually have footage from inside the womb in parts of it. So a lot of it also is like they took like ultrasounds and then we're able to like active ultrasounds and then we're colored it. And so it looks with like an actual footage also. Those are some different things there. But well worth the watch. I have no quiz on it or anything, so I can't, but I recommend it highly. Other than that, make sure you take the quiz on this. The quiz is open to you. Once you've opened this video, the quiz is open to you for this, following those 4 random facts. And make sure you do the discussion and everything this week, and you should be good to go. All right. If you have any questions, just as always, message me. Let me know, or type it in the discussions, and we'll get to you as soon as we can. Yeah, hope everything goes well, and I will see you all in the next chapter. Have a wonderful day.